The Gene Rasp, a novel, written by Patrick L. McConnell, read by the author. Within the story I'll be reading for you today, there's additional content that can be found on the internet that can be accessed through QR codes. The QR codes can be accessed by going to the website www.thegenerasp.com, going to the top of the page and finding QR code list, clicking on that, and printing out the list of codes. While I read the book, at times I will call out code numbers, and if you access this, you will find additional content that I hope you will enjoy. Chapter 1. Like a dream, it plays across imagination and becomes more real than waking. I've spent so many years refusing to write my life story until I finally realized the story wasn't about me. If everything goes to plan, but in my life that has never been the case, so who knows, the final chapter of this book will be written by another, but the final line will be written by me. I find words to be as deceptive as they are true, but I intend to tell the truth. So the best I can figure out is an egg and a sperm met in a bar, and they couldn't think of anything better to do. That's how I came to be. Like the beginning of most things, life can be tricky, so I can't say that I was left in a dumpster or on a doorstep. I do know where and how they found me, but I am choosing not to share that particular piece of information with all of you. So even though my intention is to tell the truth, I do not find it necessary to tell it all. The mind is not only a terrible thing to waste, it's a very difficult thing to understand. So I think I will start with my mind. I knew mine worked differently than all the other children and adults around me, but there was no definition, no explanation of how mine tended to process information. But to give you one advantage over me, the advantage of time, I will use the term dyslexia at this point, even though I had no idea at this point what I was dealing with. My life and experience was shaped in every possible way by this term, so I guess I need to define it. But how do I do that? The problem actually starts with the definition of dyslexia, because there are dozens, maybe even hundreds of different interpretations of what it is, particularly because there are different, I'll call them versions of what it is. So here I am writing a book, which ironically is, for me, one of my highest obstacles in life, that of reading, writing, and comprehending words on paper. And even words in general, including spoken words, because the processing in my brain was challenged with hearing, as in processing sound, as much as anything else. So if we think of the brain as an actual structure, maybe akin to a computer in some ways, the structure of the dyslexic brain is physically, and I mean by that you can see this visually inspecting a brain, formed in different ways than the average brain. So again, if we think of a computer as an analogy, you might think of my computer having a lot more circuits that need to connect each other to the computer and its programs to the end result. Say the average computer has 100 circuits as an example. A dyslexic computer might have 5 times that number. So the distance from the stimulus to understanding is enormously farther and can take much longer, or even take too long, to get to that understanding. For some reason, I'm thinking of a swimming analogy. If a young brain trying to learn something new can be thought of as that brain being thrown into a swimming pool and expected to tread water until that understanding came into being, that brain learns to hurry up so that it can get out of the water and save itself. My brain being left in the water 5 times longer for every understanding would very often simply drown. That is until I taught myself to float. But floating can look like and feel like drowning anyway. This will be the first example of my random seeming way of thinking. A poem I feel should be here. Views, might have beens, are drowning me. I can be, is prodding me. I am, is holding me in place, but forces me to examine the rest. Looking forward from a great distance is not only difficult, but a kind of harrowing experience. The longer the distance, the stranger the memory. Memory is fractal, splintering and glimmering and cascading. I understand that a life story needs to be fleshed out from the beginning, but trauma has a way of diminishing each memory and sometimes even erasing them. There is a kind of comfort in the shadows of the past being covered over with emptiness. I thought my mind was broken at a young age, that the computer just didn't have the right program, and part of the problem was not just the programming, but was the storage. Old memory can be understood as being weaker than new, but my storage problem affected even new memory. As a scientist, I knew to take copious notes. As a child, I was unable to do that. So the story of my childhood will be fractal and broken, and many pieces will be missing. Not because I'm hiding my past. It's just the result of a computer that has some glitches. My earliest memory might actually be the memory of a story I was told. I can see it in my mind as though I am remembering it, but powerful story can create the illusion of memory. So this first memory has to do with the way I moved as a child, a very young child. I never learned to crawl. That normal type of childhood locomotion was not part of my makeup. Instead, I scooted myself across the floor using one hand to prop myself up, lifting my butt off the carpet, and my 2 legs to wedge myself forward. Looked a bit like a damaged crab, I'm sure. Where other children would wear out their knees, I wore out my butt. But this, it turns out, is not a particularly popular activity, and in the home that I grew up in, there were repercussions for not doing things the way they were supposed to be done. Luckily for me, and by sheer chance, this way of movement could be faster than that of crawling. So I managed to escape some of those repercussions. But no one could ever escape Sister O'Shea. I spent a little time thinking about the prospect of changing Sister O'Shea's name into something more sinister or colorful. Part of me wants her to just disappear, and by stating her correct name, it feels like I'm bringing her back to life in some way. And even though I spent the better part of my life trying to save others' lives, saving her name is not at the top of my list of things to accomplish in this life. But in the end, I just decided what the hell. This part here might introduce you to the fact that this is kind of a conversation between you and I, me, the writer, you, the reader. So sit back and enjoy the ride. Almost every childhood memory that I wish I could forget, that seems to hold on to me like a bad cold, has something to do with Sister O'Shea. She was the administrator/ruler of West Boys' Home. I would overhear boys later describe her as the only Irish Nazi. It's hard to get into the head of someone as empty as she was, but I suppose I'll have to get into that to some degree. My first memory of her links back to my memory of my strange childhood movement disorder, as she would call it. As pain narrows perception, it also amplifies memory. I wonder if she would have ever paid attention to the scooting little creature on the floor if it hadn't been for my tripping her and my pinky being broken. She made it one of her goals to retrain me into becoming the average crawling child. She believed my goal was to antagonize her. My first lesson or retraining came about during the time the hardwood floor in her office was being repaired. I guess she noticed that after the first sanding of the floor, the hardwood was splintery. Her office, already having been emptied to have the floor done, was just like a good-sized bedroom of empty space that she decided to lock me inside of after removing my diaper. I suppose if I had been a crawler, my knees would have received the same damage that my delicate hiney finally received. You are probably wondering about my male parts. It's very nice of you to be concerned. By sheer chance, they were unscathed. So as a training tool, not a very good one. Not that I'll show you, but I have scars in that particular area to this day, as well as a crooked pinky. I just reread what I've already written and realized that I've not told you where I grew up. West Boys Home is a distinctive building, mostly distinctive because it's the only one around. There were many miles between this particular institution and the nearest habitable place. I guess you could liken it to a reservation in that its location was one that nobody else wanted at the time the place was built. So again, like a reservation, it's a place where people are put aside and have only rudimentary abilities to maintain themselves. I have a great love for the Native American population, and I suppose I have enjoyed the thought that I could be like them. So many who are set apart stand together in my mind. I remember reading Harry Potter and the part describing that Harry lived under the stairs. I think for most people reading that book, the room under the stairs seemed like something different to them than it seemed to me. The idea of having a private space, even one as small as a closet, sounded wonderful to me. Bunk beds in rows that for a small child seemed endless and foreboding constructed the maze of my world. Bathroom stalls with no doors and little to no toilet paper. Stuff that was called food but quite often was not recognizable as such. A kind of prison mentality that pervaded everything. Nearly every nun in the place seemed to be as much a prisoner as the children were. But the truth is, I didn't know any better, and so, for the most part, I didn't think any the worse for it and was grateful for the clothing and the food and the bed. Of course, as part of our prayers at the end of each day, we were made to remember how fortunate we were for all of these things and for our caregivers. I love the term caregivers. It's the first term that taught me irony. I found myself afraid of people, particularly due to their own behaviors, but in a big way because of the way I saw them. I learned later in life something valuable that I'll share here, since we're talking about some damaging moments. I found it easier to relate to every human being as if they were a child. I'm talking about adults as well. We're all just children walking through this life, and I found I could give people a lot more slack in thinking of them as a child and not as an adult. I built a better place for myself within my own mind. Certain people were better than most. Some of the people should have had very little contact with the boys, but instead were given additional responsibilities. At a very young age, I was placed with Miss Mirabelle, the cook. I was told that the first words I ever spoke were the words, Miss Marble, and that name simply stuck, at least between she and I. There was a kind of cage without a top that sat in one corner of a very large kitchen. Of course, it wasn't really a cage, but then again, cage is just a word. For my entire life, smells have had a profound effect on me, and I would say, in a general sense, a very positive effect. I'm still afraid to think of a cook having a daily involvement with diapers. The cage was constructed by Arthur Sands, the all-around handyman gardener who became the workshop teacher much later. I will say that up until I was in his class, starting at the age of 9, I found him to be a frightening individual. Arthur could not speak, not because of physical damage, but due to a decision he made for his own reasons, and that he never explained to anyone. Strangely, his silence was a comfort to me when we got to know each other better. I know most people had parents, but I had Miss Marble and Arthur. Miss Maribel called the cage the pig pen, not because she thought of me as a pig, I assure you. I think she just thought it was cute and easier for me to understand. She would even call me her little piggy once she got used to having me around. I loved the cage. For me, the cage was more or less like the room below the stairs, only I could see out, and the world could see in. When I say love, I am using it as a relative term. I should probably say prefer, but when you have so little to love, you latch on to what's available. Miss Marble was the only person in the boys' home who could care less about my speech impediment. She would tell me not to worry and that I would find my way. So I mentioned being dyslexic. But there are many things that grow out from that. I have a pretty good understanding now that the audio processing of my brain is challenged, and that has repercussions. When I read a study from Yale about the sound processing in dyslexic brains, I nearly cried and laughed at the same time. There are many ways to retrain brains now that, of course, were not available when my brain was young and malleable. So I had a very hard time making the proper word come out of my mouth at the proper time and with the proper speed. And if you can't say it properly, it's extremely difficult to learn to write it. So even if you can say it, learn to write it, then there's the obstacle of being afraid to make a mistake, especially when you talk. And of course, your intelligence is gauged so often on speech. I am talking about these issues because they define me, and because I am hopeful that in reading this, someone with the same issues or something similar might be helped. For those who find the words not coming to them, the words impossible to write, the words impossible to read, I know you, like myself. And I also know that you can change things. Things can become brighter, and you can find your way. Your brain isn't broken. It's just of a different design. And if my brain was designed differently than it is, I would have never done the things I've done, or changed the world in the way I had a hand in changing it. So that's enough of that. I felt so alone, surrounded by all these other boys and people, that I searched for a way to connect with something. And impossibly, the stories in books and film made it possible for me to walk in another's shoes. The world in my mind expanded, and in many ways, I was set free. That desperate thirst for understanding and connection made the endless toil of trying to learn to read attainable. But I had to teach myself. I began to write poetry. Here's my first poem. The wind is swift and even slow. It drifts around all day. Sometimes it will stop and rest, and sometimes it will play. But most of all, you see it drift away.